What if the plant you've been told brings peace could also be the very thing keeping you stuck? Cannabis has been praised, criminalized, worshipped, and misunderstood, but behind the smoke lies a deeper truth that most never dare to ask. This isn't about judging whether it's good or bad. It's about uncovering the forgotten wisdom of ancient traditions, from India to Africa, from Taoist monks to Sufi mystics, who treated this plant not as an escape, but as a spiritual tool with real consequences. If you've ever wondered why cannabis affects people so differently, or whether it's helping or harming your inner journey, you're not alone. In the next few minutes, you'll discover how cannabis interacts with your energy, your shadow, your ego, and how its use without structure can lead to spiritual stagnation rather than evolution. This isn't another opinion piece. It's a roadmap based on ancient insights and modern reflection. So if you're ready to see cannabis not just as a habit, but as a mirror and possibly a doorway, then stay with us. Like and share this video with someone who's also seeking something deeper than smoke. Let's go beyond the surface together. Long before cannabis became a topic of debate in modern culture, it was a revered element in the spiritual traditions of ancient civilizations. This plant wasn't just a substance. It was a symbol, a sacred ally in the dialogue between human and divine. In ancient India, cannabis held a place among the 5 most holy plants, mentioned in the Atharva Veda as a gift from the gods. It wasn't something used casually. It was part of a sacred relationship. The followers of Shiva, known as sadhus, didn't approach the plant for pleasure or escape. They sat in silence with it, often after days of fasting and chanting, using it as a catalyst for deep meditation and ego dissolution. For them, smoking wasn't recreation. It was a ritual that tore down illusion and brought them closer to truth. Across the globe, in Taoist circles of ancient China, the plant appeared again, not as a drug, but as a tool in the alchemical journey toward longevity and spiritual clarity. Taoist healers mixed it with ginseng and other herbs to provoke lucid visions, guiding practitioners through inner realms of awareness. But even there, cannabis was treated with caution. The wisdom passed down warned that the plant amplifies whatever is already within. If you were calm and balanced, it could reveal insight. If you were scattered or chaotic, it could just as easily magnify the storm. Sacred use of cannabis was never isolated to one culture. In African and indigenous American shamanic traditions, the plant, when it was used, was approached like any other power plant, with ceremony, humility, and intention. It wasn't the chemical properties of the herb that mattered most, but the presence and energy it carried. Healers understood that the plant had a spirit, and that spirit required respect. Even in the mystical teachings of Gnostic sects and early Christian groups like the Essenes, evidence suggests cannabis may have been present in oils used for anointing and purification. There again, its use wasn't personal indulgence. It was communal, liturgical, and woven into a larger cosmology. Wherever it appeared, the pattern was the same. Cannabis was sacred when it was used in context, supported by ritual, tradition, and reverence. It was never the source of spiritual power itself. It was a key. And keys, as every mystic knows, are not meant to be worshipped. They are meant to open doors, but the door it opens depends entirely on who turns the key. There are moments when silence speaks louder than any ceremony. For the mystics who turned to cannabis as part of their practice, the plant wasn't about escape. It was about confrontation. It stripped away illusions, not gently but thoroughly in Tai. The paths of wandering ascetics and desert mystics, the goal was never intoxication, it was surrender. To dissolve the ego was not to become numb. It was to become transparent, to let the boundaries of the self melt into something vaster. Among Indian yogis, smoking cannabis was one part of a larger discipline that included solitude, fasting, and recitation of sacred mantras. It wasn't an act of indulgence. It was a ritual of undoing, a stripping of layers. The same spirit pulsed through certain Sufi orders in the medieval Islamic world. In dim-lit circles, some mystics used hashish as a companion in their pursuit of fana, the complete erasure of the self in divine presence. These moments were not meant for pleasure, but for vanishing into the beloved. Yet not all Sufis embraced the practice. The poet Rumi, one of the tradition's most luminous voices, cautioned against seeking God through intoxication when divine presence already danced in the sober breath of existence. This paradox echoed across time. Cannabis could point to the sacred, but it could just as easily become a crutch. When used to bypass discomfort instead of face it, the plant's purpose was lost. Even mystics immersed in devotion knew that tools must eventually be set down, that the real path lay not in sensation, but in surrender. The act of dissolving. The ego isn't glamorous, it's raw. The mind resists, the body aches, the soul panics before it softens. In those sacred traditions, cannabis didn't make this easier. It made it unavoidable. That was its power. In the language of ancient energy systems, everything vibrates. Every substance, every thought, every breath carries a frequency. Cannabis, in this view, isn't neutral. It amplifies. It magnifies what's already inside you and projects it outward like a mirror held too close to the eyes. Taoist alchemists knew this. They wrote of the plant's ability to stir the currents of qi, the vital life force that flows through all living things. When the internal system was aligned, when breath, body, and mind were in harmony, cannabis could refine that current, sharpening perception, deepening awareness. But when the system was misaligned, when emotions were scattered, or the spirit was restless, the plant intensified the chaos. This wasn't metaphor. It was experience. In modern terms, we might say cannabis doesn't change who you are. It just turns up the volume. A calm person may feel more peaceful. An anxious person may spiral. The plant doesn't discriminate, it reflects. This energetic amplification explains why some users feel relaxed, while others feel trapped. For those with unresolved tension, cannabis often doesn't bring relief, it brings exposure. The inner world becomes louder, brighter, harder to ignore, and when there's no framework to process what's revealed, confusion sets in. This is why ancient traditions always paired the use of such substances with structure. Rituals, mantras, breathing techniques. These weren't just spiritual accessories, they were energetic tools to channel the intensified current the plant unlocked. Without them, the experience could quickly become overwhelming or deceptive. Cannabis doesn't create balance, it tests it. It asks a simple but often unsettling question: are you ready to feel everything you've been avoiding? Not every reflection is welcome. Some show beauty, others truth. And often those two aren't the same. Cannabis, when used without filters or distractions, acts like a mirror that doesn't blink. It reflects what's there, not what we wish to see. For many, that means confronting emotions long buried beneath the surface, guilt that simmers, fears left unspoken, questions we've postponed for years. The plant doesn't heal those things. It simply shines a light on them. This is where misunderstanding often begins. People assume that because they feel something deeply while using cannabis, peace or sadness, revelation, it must be healing them. But feeling isn't the same as transformation. Insight alone changes nothing. It's what happens after the insight that matters. The mirror shows the wound. The work is in how you tend to it. Some feel an intense sense of calm while under the influence of cannabis. But is that calm rooted in awareness, or is it sedation dressed in spiritual language? Real peace is active. It exists not in silence, but in the ability to be fully present, even in chaos. The danger lies in mistaking the mirror for the medicine. Cannabis has never been a cure-all. In spiritual traditions, it was never viewed as a shortcut to enlightenment. At most, it was a revealer, an agent of truth. But if the truth it reveals isn't faced, the mirror becomes fogged with illusions. What feels like clarity turns into comfort. What feels like progress turns into pause. And so the plant asks, will you look honestly at what I show you? Or will you turn away and call it light? There's a part of us that doesn't want to be seen, not by others, not even by ourselves. It's made of all the things we've tucked away, the disappointments we never processed, the envy we pretend not to feel, the wounds we didn't know how to name. This is the shadow. And cannabis, in certain moments, opens the door to it without asking for permission. Carl Jung described the shadow not as evil, but as everything the ego refuses to integrate. It's our unlived life, our hidden reactions, our repressed pain. When cannabis strips away the filters of daily identity, this shadow can rise, uninvited and overwhelming. The sensation isn't always psychedelic. Sometimes it's just raw discomfort. That's why many people feel anxious or paranoid when they smoke. It's not the plant causing those feelings, it's the plant removing the buffer that normally keeps them buried. This kind of confrontation can be valuable if it's met with honesty and courage. But here's where the trap lies. Instead of facing what arises, many seek to bypass it. They use the spiritual feeling cannabis can produce as a shield, a way to say, I'm evolving, without having to do the work of actual change. This is spiritual bypassing, using altered states to avoid transformation rather than invite it. It's easy to feel profound when you're high. It's harder to ask, has anything in my life actually shifted because of this? Have I become more compassionate, more grounded, more real? Cannabis can show you the hidden self, but it can't integrate it for you. That work requires discipline, reflection, and the kind of patience that no plant can provide. Without that, the insights become noise and the shadow just finds new places to hide. Spiritual work is not just psychological, it's energetic. And cannabis, when used without intention or preparation, can turn your energy field into an open window in a storm. In the world of esoteric traditions, the human aura is seen as a subtle shield, a dynamic boundary that protects the self while allowing in what is aligned. When consciousness is altered through plants, rituals, or trauma, that boundary softens. If the space is held with care, this softening can lead to deep revelations. But if it's not, the field becomes porous, leaving room for confusion, interference, or worse, energetic parasites that feed on chaos. This isn't superstition. It's a recognition that consciousness operates across layers, some emotional, others vibrational. Western mystics like Dion Fortune warned of this over a century ago. She observed that people who entered altered states without grounding, structure, or protection often experienced spiritual disorientation and energetic depletion. She described these moments not as mystical breakthroughs, but as psychic vulnerability. A soul, wide open, without guidance, is like a house with all the doors unlocked. Raja Yoga makes similar observations. In the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali mentions that certain herbs can provoke siddhis, supernatural abilities or visions. But he warns, these are distractions if they arise without ethical grounding. Powers that appear in an untrained mind feed the spiritual ego, which is more dangerous than ignorance because it masquerades as truth. Modern users often interpret heightened sensitivity after cannabis use as a sign of awakening, and sometimes it is. But sensitivity without clarity is like turning up the volume in a room full of static. You hear more, but you understand less. This is why ancient traditions insisted on context, not to restrict experience, but to protect it. Cannabis can open the gates, But without spiritual hygiene, you won't know who or what is stepping through them. Once a sacred key in temples and ceremonies, cannabis has become something else entirely in the modern world. A trend, a product, a punchline. Its spiritual roots have been tangled in wires of commerce, rebellion, and marketing. What was once ritual is now routine. What was once liturgy is now lifestyle branding. In many ancient cultures, the plant was introduced through initiation, guided by elders or spiritual leaders. It was surrounded by meaning, by structure. It had a place, a purpose, a boundary. But in today's culture, boundaries are blurred. Cannabis is sold in sleek packaging, promoted in memes, and smoked as casually as one might sip a cup of coffee. The loss here isn't moral. It's symbolic. When sacred tools are stripped of context, they lose their depth. The experience might still feel good, might even feel profound, but without a container, it spills. Without a map, it drifts. The power of the plant becomes fragmented, and the user becomes more of a consumer than a seeker. This shift isn't new. In the 1960s, the psychedelic movement tried to reclaim spiritual use of substances, cannabis included. But it often did so without lineage, without discipline. Eastern teachings were mixed with political ideologies and artistic experimentation. People read Huxley, listened to Leary, and declared enlightenment. But they skipped the part about integration, about transformation beyond the trip. Even today, much of cannabis culture is shaped not by sacred tradition, but by aesthetics, bohemian vibes, stoner comedy, countercultural fashion. The plant is everywhere, yet rarely grounded in its origins. It's been reduced to mood management, not consciousness expansion. And still, beneath the noise, the plant remains what it always was, potential. The tragedy isn't that cannabis is used for recreation. It's that its deeper purpose has been forgotten. And without remembrance, there is no reverence. Without reverence, there's no container. And without a container, there's no transformation, only repetition. In every tradition where cannabis was considered sacred, it was never used in isolation. There were songs, there were circles, there was rhythm, intention, and guidance. The plant was not passed around for pleasure. It was invoked, received, and respected. Alone it meant little. Together it meant everything. Among the Rastas, the herb is a sacrament. It is lit during reasoning sessions, where members of the community gather not just to smoke, but to reflect, to speak truth, to connect with the divine in each other. The herb becomes part of the dialogue, not the destination. It humbles, centers, and holds space. In many Afro-Indigenous traditions, plants are never consumed without context. They are introduced through ritual, under the eye of a guide, accompanied by chants, prayers, offerings. The experience isn't about escape, it's about connection. One voice joins many. The plant is not the center, it is the bridge. Modern users often miss this entirely. Solitary use in a dark room hoping for peace or answers has little to do with how sacred plants were ever meant to be used. The community is not an optional bonus, it's part of the medicine. The collective acts as container, compass, and witness. It keeps the ego in check. It holds you when the mirror gets too sharp. It reminds you what's real. Ritual doesn't mean superstition, it means structure. A space where energy can move in a certain direction, where insight can land and not get lost. Without ritual, the plant's potential remains scattered, its power diluted. And so the deeper question arises, are you using the plant to escape your solitude, or are you using it to return to a sacred togetherness? In the oldest traditions, cannabis was never just inhaled. It was welcomed, with silence, with song, with the presence of others who understood that healing is never a solo act. There's a kind of glow that feels like wisdom, but disappears when the smoke clears. A sense of clarity, of depth, of connection. that vanishes the moment life demands action. This is the seduction of sensation. And cannabis, when used without awareness, can be its most convincing disguise. The plant can trigger moments that feel cosmic. A sentence suddenly sounds like scripture. A breeze feels like revelation. Everything appears to shimmer with meaning. But ask yourself, what do those moments change? Do they make you more patient, more truthful, more present with the people you love, or do they just give you the feeling of progress without its reality? There's a quiet danger in confusing stimulation with spirituality. Feeling high is not the same as being awake. Having insights is not the same as living them. Cannabis can make everything seem profound, even the ego, especially the ego. This is how illusions take root. The sensation of knowing replaces the practice of learning. The comfort of insight replaces the courage to change, and soon the ritual becomes routine, and the journey becomes a loop. Real spiritual practice doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it's dry, sometimes it's silent, sometimes it asks you to sit in your confusion without running, without reaching, for anything to soften it. That's where growth happens. Not in the brightness of the vision, but in the shadows you agree to walk through without a flashlight. Cannabis can support this process, but only if you stop mistaking the light it shows for the light you generate. Sensation fades, transformation stays. Cannabis opens doors, but not all doors should be walked through blindly. Spiritual traditions across time have always emphasized the same truth. Tools are only as powerful as the hands that wield them. And no tool, no plant, no practice can replace discernment. In Vedanta, this clarity is called viveka, the ability to separate what is eternal from what is fleeting, what is real from what is merely sensation. In Greek thought, it was krino, the judgment that helps one navigate between illusion and essence. Without it, even light can deceive, because not everything that feels true is true. Intuition can sometimes be desire in disguise. Insight can be emotional noise dressed as wisdom. And spiritual experiences, when unexamined, can inflate the ego more than they dissolve it. Cannabis doesn't promise wisdom. It offers a possibility, a mirror, a test. The real question isn't whether the plant can take you somewhere meaningful. The question is whether you're ready for what it shows you, whether you have the structure, the humility, and the honesty to respond to what's revealed. Discernment means asking, what is this teaching me, really? What part of me wants this experience, and why? What will I do with what I see? The plant, like all sacred substances, is neutral. It becomes sacred only through the context we create around it, through intention, ritual, community, and follow-through. Without those things, even the most beautiful vision becomes hollow. True spirituality isn't measured by how far your mind travels while under the influence. It's measured by how deeply your actions reflect truth after the high fades. It's not about what you feel, it's about what you become. The plant may offer a glimpse, but only your awareness can walk the path.